things that affects us really in our lives is systemic risk, the possibility that financial markets can and do collapse. I have shown you this picture. This is depiction of a complex system. Now we will think of these nodes as financial institutions. Their state is what is the capital that they have and nothing else. And the links between financial institutions is contracts. This is agreements on future cash flows. What can this be? This can be credit, this can be options, this can be derivatives, other derivatives, can be futures, can be foreign exchange, bets, can be weather derivatives, can be whatever you can trade. Yeah? Everything you can trade is a different type of interaction. And what I did not show you is that if you characterize the state of the node, the capitalization, by color, for example, and the interaction type, if you call that M for matrix, where you link node I or bank I and bank J, of interaction type alpha, then we can write down what the problem is. The problem is, or why this thing is a complex system. If you change your states, as this was the state, the color, the capitalization, if this is some function that depends on the states and on the interactions, whatever this function is, if you have only this, I told you that this is what physics can do. You fix this M, you give initial conditions, whatever these equations are, you try to solve them, you predict these states. If you couple, if these interactions are not constant over time, but if they change themselves as another function that depend on the states and the interactions, then you have this complex system type. Yeah? For the physicists among you, if you have the simplest physics system that is of this kind, this coupled thing is general relativity, where you have where your motion depends on space. You need a space to say what motion is, but depending on how fast you move, this is bending space, because moving faster changes masses, changes space, and space you need for defining what the motion is. This is why the Einstein equations are so extremely hard to solve. It's exactly of this type. This is the most complicated thing in physics. Okay, and this, yeah. Okay, I was telling you that complex systems of this type, they are dominated by power laws, by outliers, statistics of outliers. If you have a system where you have always long, far outliers, these systems are not controllable, or these are extremely dangerous. In terms of financial markets, a big outlier means a big loss. It can also mean a big win, but the win is nice and fine, but a loss, if it's very big, is disastrous. If we have details about the interactions, the contracts, and the states, the capitalization of banks, can we break this complexity? Can we understand this complexity? What do we have to prove to show that we can manage it? We have to get rid of the tails. We have to cut off the tail. We have to go down to hell, cut off the tail of the devil, and then demonstrate that you really cut it off. Otherwise, you cannot control this system. Or if you always have these large outliers, the system remains dangerous. So there's three types of financial risk. The first type of financial risk is economic risk. This is the risk. You invent a new product, you have an idea, Then you want to bring it to the market. So you have to build a prototype. This costs something. Who is financing it? Maybe your parents help you, or your grandmother gives you a little bit of money. You can produce the prototype. Then you want to sell this prototype. No one buys it. And your grandmother has lost her investment. Yeah, this is economic risk. You come up with an idea and it does not work. That's economic risk. Happens a lot. Credit default risk is another type of risk. Right? Yeah. Credit default risk is the risk that if I give you something, you don't give it back to me. This is credit default risk. So how do we manage this risk? This risk we manage by two things. If I think you cannot repay me, or if I think there's a probability that you don't repay me, I charge you an interest rate. So that if I lend much of money to all of you, on average, I will get back. I will not get back everything, but the interest rate compensates for my losses. This is what everyone is doing. And if we are doing this on a global scale, if the way we are controlling the financial system nowadays is that before I can lend to you, I have to show to the central bank or to the regulator that I have a certain capital buffer in my vaults. In case someone does not repay me, that I'm not immediately out of business. Okay? This is capital cushions, and there's a requirement that it's more or less 8%, 6 to 10%, something of this order of all the outstanding credits that I give, I have to keep in my basement. You cannot touch it. This we call the Basel type regulation. Basel is a city in Switzerland where the banking regulation authorities sit that come up with these ideas. And then there's systemic risk. Systemic risk is the risk that the system collapses, goes out of business, cannot no longer perform its functions. What I told you is that collapse is very often associated with restructuring, a massive restructuring of networks, and very often the networks just collapse, the links go away. This is a collapse. In a financial system, if no more links are happening, no more contracts are being done. If you want a credit, you don't get it. In a very simple way. So no more links, the link density goes down, everyone sits on his or her wealth, and nothing happens. So you cannot realize your ideas anymore, you cannot build your prototype, you cannot buy an apartment, you cannot open up a company, and everything stops. And then the financial problem percolates into the real economy, and then you get jobless rates going up, and then real economic disaster may follow. Systemic risk is not the same as credit default risk. People are always confusing this, creates confusion. If I am a bank, I care about you paying me back. That's all I care about. I don't care if the system goes bankrupt or not, if the whole system crashes or not. If the whole system crashes, all my competitors also crash. So I don't care. And I cannot even care. Even if I want to care, I cannot care. Why? Because I do not know the network. But there is someone who knows the network. It's typically the central bank knows the financial network. Who owes what to whom. So to manage systemic risk, it should be the business of the regulator and not of the banks necessarily. There's two types of systemic risk. One is synchronization of behavior. Somdatta has shown you something about synchronization before. So synchronization of agents in financial markets is typically herding behavior. I see everyone is buying this kind of stuff, then I will also buy this stuff. Can be rational even, because if they make lots of money, if I don't do it, then I will fall behind. So I better stay close, even if it's idiotic to do so. It's still rational to follow them. There's other ways of reasons why herding is happening, but I'm not going to talk about this. I'm only going to talk about the systemic risk that arises through the networks of contracts. This is the first picture taken almost 20 years ago of a financial network. The dots are banks, and links are credits between the banks. It's the picture of an interbank market of a small country. These are the different types of interactions we have. We can have lending, borrowing. This is loans, credits or loans. We can have derivative layers. So this is always the same bank and the different layers, and the links here is deals, contracts on credit, on derivatives, on foreign exchange, on liquidity, on foreign exchange, whatever you can trade. This is a snapshot of the exposures between financial institutions in Mexico. This is the 50 most important banks in Mexico. The size of these nodes is the capitalization. So this is how big they are, how much turnover they have, or no, not turnover. How much capital they have is proportional to the size of the bank, and the links are the credits. Here, the links is a different layer, the same banks, and the links are not the credits, but it's the exposures from the foreign exchange contracts they have with other banks. So it's basically bets if the dollar goes up or down. This is the network of risks that comes from securities. This is bonds, and this is the layer from derivatives. And if you combine these four most important layers, you get this complete systemic risk. The colors we will talk about now. The colors is the systemic risk. What is systemic risk? How can we quantify it? All we have is capitalization. All we have is the network. That's the input. How can we quantify systemic risk? So we want a number. Ideally, we want a number that tells us if a bank goes out of business, what's the damage this causes? And so we want to kind of rank the different banks according to their systemic risk. Google has had a similar problem. They want to rank the importance of web pages, and many of you will know this Google algorithm, the PageRank algorithm. Maybe you have learned in the first week. A web page is very important if many other important web pages link to it. If you have a link from one page to another, this is this interaction, the link. And if a few important guys point to you, you are also important. You can also be important if many unimportant guys are pointing to you. So your importance depends on the whole network, basically. This is PageRank. So a page is important if many important pages point to you. Systemic risk we can see in a very similar way. An institution or a bank is systemically risky if systemically institutions lend to it. That's very, very similar. We don't call it PageRank, now we call it DebtRank. So it's friends of us who invented this. It's a little bit more complicated than PageRank. In PageRank, you don't have capitalization. And now I will, for those of you who are not interested in details, I will bore you for 5 minutes, so you can, those of you who are not interested, you can doze off for 5 minutes, then I will wake you up again. So what is this PageRank? Not PageRank, what is this DebtRank? It's a recursive method. It's, can you tell me in the first week, when you learned about networks, did you learn what eigenvector centrality is? Yes, you did. PageRank is something similar to eigenvector centrality. It's something a little bit more clever. So if eigenvector centrality, then maybe you have heard about Katz's rank. Yeah. Katz's rank is very much related to PageRank. Katz's rank is very much related to what we want to do here. But we have this capitalization there, and we have another problem. If we compute the Katz's rank, we can just invert a matrix, basically. If we do that, implicitly what we are doing, we are taking, how should I say? Whenever we have a cycle in the network, we're effectively going over this infinitely many times. If you think of how the algorithm works, you will see that this is nonsense in a banking network. No bank is collapsing twice. First time you're going out of business, you're out of business. So you cannot directly compute the Katz's rank by inverting one matrix once. You have to take more caution. You should simulate how everyone is going out of business. So we have a banking system, we're kicking out one bank, and from now on we start simulating what is happening to the other banks. If this bank cannot repay in the next time step its loans, how much does the capital of the others go down? If the capital is going down too much, then they have to adjust their balance sheets. And if in their balance sheets you fall below certain equity levels, you're out of business. Once you're out of business, you can also no longer repay your loans. So the DebtRank is doing that, is doing exactly that. If we would not have the problem that we could default twice, go out of business twice, then we would just use the Katz's rank. Okay? So, the Katz's rank, where we correct for loops that we have there. The most important thing, the network we have, we call the asset liability network. Let's, for simplicity, just think of credits. The asset liability network is Lij, meaning that J gives a loan of size capital L to I. J to I. We read it from right to left. From this L, we compute the exposure network. It's just, in this way, we bring in the information about the capitalization of every bank. We divide L, Jij, divide by the capital of bank J. If we have huge capital, our exposure is very small. So we can cover losses, not very dangerous. It's kind of the leverage ratio, if you've heard this term. So we define this exposure network, more or less reasonable, or even 100% reasonable to do this. And we can define the sum of outstanding loans of bank I is just the sum over all banks that I has lent to. Sum over J is all the neighboring banks of the loans that I has lent to J. Outstanding loans. And let us just call the fraction of the outstanding loans compared to all loans that are in the system. Let's call this little b sub I for bank I. So the impact of bank I on its neighbors, if I default, it will not repay to J. This is the impact of I on its neighbors. So this is the fraction of the outstanding loans of J this is the exposure from J to I, the exposure from J to I. If you sum over all partners, this is the impact it has to the nearest neighbors. But as we said, we should take also the next to nearest neighbors into account. If we look at the impact to the next to nearest neighbors and to all neighbors, then the impact is what we had before, plus the next iterative step, and we weigh it with a number that, as we have learned from the Katz rank, with a little beta here. And now we still could invert this, like the Katz rank, but this impact could turn out to be larger than 1. This is because of these stupid cycles. And now, to solve this problem, we do this simulation, right? So what we do is we say we have this banking network, we specify a set of banks, can be only one, but a set of failing banks as failing as F, and then we simulate over time what I just said. We kick one out, simulate what's happening. Whoever does not get repaid something from the others is in distress. We remember that, and if the distress factor is going to 1, it's a number between 0 and 1. So we have a factor here. If that is going to 1, in the next time step, the bank will be out of business. It's modeling what's happening in your balance sheet. And in your balance sheet, if your equity is going to 0 or negative, you're out. That's all. Yes?
I wasn't able to understand the exposure.
Sorry?
The W exposure.
The W, you want to understand it better?
If you could, please.
So the important part is this. So it's the loan from J. J gave money, a loan to I. Yeah. If I now defaults, if I defaults, I will not repay Lij, the sum to J. It will not. So J has to cover this loss. The capital that J has is Cj. So the fraction of the possible loss that J gets from I in relation to what J has is the exposure. Yeah? And the exposure should maybe not be smaller than 1. So we also keep in we keep the total. If it's 1, then you basically don't have exposure.
You don't have exposure.
Yeah. So if the risk, if you give a loan to someone that's the same size as your capital, it's 1, then it's maximum risk. Sorry, I just said a stupid thing, and this should be smaller, typically. Yeah. So now you're doing an iterative way. This was the first neighbors. You compute the impact, and then you go and take the first orders into the next neighborhood. And if you do it again, you get the next nearest neighbors, etc. Okay, if this is the total stress that we put in at the first time step, if we subtract that from the total stress in the system after the tth time step, this is the debt rank for the set of banks that we put in distress in the beginning. So we get, and this is a number, it's a fraction of the total, of the amount of loans that are affected by the default of this initial set of banks that we put in distress. If we do it only for one bank, we get the cost of default in the system of a single bank as a fraction of the total credit volume in the system. Okay, so our input is the network of contracts and the capitalization, and the output is the percentage of the total damage that happens if Bank I goes out of business. Systemic risk, that's very important, spreads by borrowing. If I have no systemic risk now, and if I need 1 million rupees, I can approach you, and you're not connected to the rest of the world. You're just a rich individual. You give me this 1 million, and suppose that the lightning hits me, I'm gone. I will not repay you. You will be very angry, but nothing happens. If I take a contract from you, 1 million rupees for 2% per year, but you are connected to the rest of the world, you're a big player. If I don't repay you, I might bring you into trouble and you might not be able to repay your things. So if I borrow from you, I inherit systemic risk by borrowing from you. If I borrow from you, I inherit nothing. So in terms of minimizing systemic risk, I should borrow from you. Then this system is more stable. So it's not very deep, but why I'm putting this here is because credit default risk spreads the opposite way. You loan to me, then you have the risk. Risk spreads by lending. So systemic risk goes the opposite direction. So these are two banks. This is a big bank, this is a small bank, and after one time step, the small bank takes a big credit from the big bank, and you see how the systemic risk changes. The systemic risk is the color. If it's dark red, it's close to 1. If it's green, it's 0 risk. So red is in between, so this is middle systemic risk. And this bank becomes much more systemically risky than this big one, even though it's small, but just taking a single credit. Yeah? So this shows you details matter extremely. If you have the banking network and if you don't know it exactly, it helps you nothing. Why? Because a single link in a network can change the eigenvector centrality. That's the basic thing. If you have a little bit of feeling, you know why this is true. And in the same way, it changes also the cut centrality and also this centrality. So this is the network of all Austrian banks at a particular point in time. On this circle here, I put the 20 most important systemically relevant banks. These are the biggest banks. Big banks are very often very systemically risky, but also there's tiny banks. If this bank goes out of business, it's even worse that this bank goes out of business. So size does not matter at all. Not at all, but these guys are more, or this one is more systemically risky than those big ones. The position in the network determines your systemic risk. The position in your network, and of course the local structure of your network. This is the debt rank for the individual 20 most systemically relevant banks in Austria. As I said, it's a fraction, so it's 80%. If this bank goes out of business, 80% of all credits stop. 80% of all financial payments will stop if everything happens according to law or to rules. In reality, this will never happen. Politicians will step in and say, how are we solving this? And then some tax money will be given to banks, but it's very dirty business. And this is kind of, if you have this profile, you know a lot about your country. This is the profile for Mexico. If you look at it, you see that if this bank goes bankrupt, only a third of the financial flows stop, not 80%. Much, much, much safer. Why? Because the network looks very different. It's much sparser. There's much less contagion going on, much less possibility for cascading events. So if you have these profiles, this profile or this profile, how big is the next financial crisis? We can come up with an index. An index, we call it expected systemic loss. This is the debt rank of your bank, this number that we computed, times the probability that this bank defaults. If we sum over all banks in the system, we get a number, and that number is this expected systemic loss. And it looks like a very simple approximation, right? That's the simplest thing you can do. But it's actually the result of it's a result of a more complicated situation. You should average over all possible scenarios. One scenario is that this bank goes out of business, or this one, or this one, or this one. But it could also be two banks that go out of business at the same time, or another pair of banks, or another one. And all the possible combinations of how banks can go out of business is given by this horrible combinatorial factor. If you work it out, this very simple result remains, that the expected systemic loss, which is an average of the losses of all possible scenarios, is just the sum over all banks, probability of default times the systemic risk factor, debt rank. So we did a little approximation here, that the debt rank of a set of defaulting banks is the sum of the debt ranks of these banks. It's not true, it's a non-linear thing. But if you do this approximation, you can test the exact result and the approximation, and they're very, very close. So it's a good approximation. Okay. If you plot this expected systemic loss, sorry.
How do you know the probability of default?
That's a good question. In central banks, you have whole teams of people who try to figure this out. What is the probability of default? If I'm a bank, if I'm giving loans to my customers, I have to know the quality of the customers. That determines the likelihood of my default. Yeah. And it's not the other banks that determine the likelihood of my default, it's the customers. So I have to know the customers. And depending on to whom I lend, I have different default probabilities, and good central banks have good teams of estimating this probability. But it's a very good question, because this default probability should not contain much network information. The network risk should be captured by this, and this is the property of my customers. But very often these teams of people in the central bank, they also think of this a little bit. So they're mixing it. So our claim is, please try to work this out purely based on the customers.
The network will be dependent on this probability of default, the net of weight at least. So a link will be formed if I perceive that the probability of default is low. So how can you say that both of them are exogenous to each other?
Yes. In general, I think you're right. In practice, you are not right because default rates for many banks are practically the same.
The asset profile of all of the banks. Some banks have more risky asset profile than.
Yes, but if you look in practice how banks are lending to itself, there's a LIBOR rate, it's a rate, and they are all the same rate. So even though in reality the riskiness of default is different, the rate is the same, so they don't care. But we're not talking much about interest rates. As I said, in general, I think you're thinking completely right. I think in practice it does not matter. At least in this context, not. Yeah. If we are plotting this expected systemic loss for Mexico, this is the light gray line. You see that before the crisis it was there, after the crisis it's there. If you compare with other risk measures, not necessarily systemic risk measures, but it's the only risk measures that we have is maybe the volatility index or the spread of government bonds. This is shown in dark black here. This is the volatility index. This is a market-based indicator. This is this size here. It's the same size here. It always goes back to previous, after crisis, it goes back to, so the market is pricing systemic risk wrong, completely wrong, by a factor of 5 to 10 wrong. Also, government bonds are not getting it right. Markets are pricing systemic risk wrong. Why? Because they don't know the network. It's very simple. This is, if this was the data for Greece, for example, they had suffered a lot from the financial crisis. If you tell them that today, it's not today, but after the crisis, the cost for the next crisis would be 5 times more, then this would be a disaster. No? They would start to kill their politicians for letting this happen. The next crisis is going to be much more costly than the previous one. Okay, so if we were implementing such an index for every region in the world, we could see how our politicians are doing. If certain measures make sense in terms of reducing systemic risk or not. We could monitor. So no one knows how policy measures act out. With this index, we could see at least if our system is getting safer or more dangerous. So now, this is an observation which was unexpected, but I think it's fantastic. Systemic risk you can measure for every transaction, not only for every node, but also for every link. So this is the size of every credit in the Austrian interbank market. This is the systemic risk of it. If you look, this is a double logarithmic plot again. If I want loans of this size, I see that I can get loans that create this systemic risk, and I also get loans that create this systemic risk. And if you ask what is the difference, it's a factor of 10,000. And that's a big difference. So if I can find loans that are 10,000 times less risky, I should take those loans and avoid those that are super risky. So we want a mechanism that gets rid of these super risky credits. It's also true for the other layers. This is the data for Mexico. The credits is the blue one and the derivatives is the green ones. You always see this cloud. Here's the diagonal. This is the value of the asset. And this is the damage it will cause. Everything is above the diagonal. So you're creating more damage than you can pay for it. That's systemic risk. But the systemic risk is above the diagonal if you plot it against the value of the contract, creating more damage. And who is paying that? The taxpayer. It's you, usually. That's and you can see every contract, how much will we pay if that bank goes out of business? If this transaction belongs to that bank, or no matter to whom it belongs, this transaction will cause this much, the difference to the diagonal that someone else has to pay. The bank will not pay because it's out of business. So if you have never seen systemic risk, this is systemic risk.
So this point here is
A contract, a credit,
to a possible edge, right? A possible edge between.
a possible edge, an edge.
If one
Between two banks, you have many edges, many contracts. If you're adding them all up, you are netting it. But these are individual ones, they are not netted. How long are they connected? So it depends on the time to maturity of the contract. So when we make a contract that you give me 1,000 rupees, we write down at January 1st, 2022, I repay. So we are connected for 3 more years we are connected. And on January 1st, 2002, the link goes away,
so
if I repay.
shorter, then the integration of the risk is perhaps less, right? So if I'm going to pay you back in 1 day, then it's better than like,
You have to take into account the length of the...
how can you take into account temporal aspects of
How can you take this into account if you know the time to maturity of contracts? Which central banks, if the contracts are big, they know. They know the details of the big contracts. So depends on countries. In Spain, they know every contract that's bigger than 6,000 euros, not so much. In Germany, it has to be more than €500,000. And I think in England, they don't look at it at all, so they have no clue about these links. So it's very heterogeneous.
So here you calculated expected loss for links. How did you, so you have to calculate debt rank for links?
How do you do? No, you cannot directly compute the debt rank for a link, but you compute the system with the link. So you have the network, you add a link, compute the debt rank, then you take the link away, compute the debt rank, and the difference is that. So this is a big message. Systemic risk is an externality. You're producing risk that someone else pays. And this is the only way, if something is an externality, this is the only way when you are allowed to tax something in the capitalist world. We're living in a capitalist world, so we are allowed to tax transactions. How big should that tax be? So if I take a credit from you, and if we are creating systemic risk of 5 rupees per year, the tax maybe should be 5 rupees. I deposit it. If I repay you, maybe I can take it back. Or the government keeps it. It's what they would maybe prefer, that they have a way of income. But in principle, it's just a deposit. It should sit there. In case we would default, or I would default, I would lose everything, but the systemic risk that's created can be covered by this deposit. This deposit we call the systemic risk tax. So if in the example before, if I borrow from you and you're not connected to the rest of the world, or if you're connected in a way that you can cover my loss, then the systemic risk tax is 0. And if I take it from you, and we create lots, then the tax is big. So, if we want to manage systemic risk, since the network plays such an important role, we have to restructure the network. How do we have to restructure the network? We have to restructure it in a way that cascading processes get very, very rare. The dangerous thing about systemic risk is cascading. I default, you default, many of you default, almost all default. This is why the politicians intervene at the very beginning all the time, because this is really the worst outcome of all. So, and we know that we can build different types of networks which are cascading in different ways. If I have a good cloth, if I burn a hole in it, the hole will always be the same size. If I have a cheap thing, every time I wash it, the hole gets bigger. It's different types of network, and one is just better. Okay, so I said this. If we introduce this tax, I will, since I have to put this deposit somewhere, I will try to not do for the first time I get an incentive to not do the deal with you. Even though we're doing deals since years, we know each other, we trust each other, we want to do the next deal, but if I have to pay such a big tax for our deal, I might switch to another credit provider. That's it. So we're taking this link, putting it there. We're restructuring the network. And if we are all doing that, what is happening? What's happening? So we want this tax, not that anyone pays it, but just as an incentive to restructure the network. Now how can we show what's happening? We need an agent-based model. Now we use this model that I've shown you 2 days ago. We have these households, we have a company network, we have this financial network, the interbank network, and firms are producing something, people are working for the companies, firms are shipping and selling things to other companies, they're selling things to the households. If firms have surplus, they deposit in the financial sector. If households have surplus, they deposit in the banking sector. If they want to buy something, they're taking loans out of it. The link is missing, just missing. If firms are not doing so well, they kick out workers. Then these guys become jobless. Then when they're jobless, they're looking for another job. They are applying for other jobs. If these companies are in supply, if they want to produce if they want to produce more, they hire people. If not, they don't. So it's a very rich model. And if one of these companies has taken out a loan from a bank to pay wages or something, and if this company sells too little to households, sooner or later will go out of business. If it has a loan, it cannot repay the loan. How is the bank reacting? It has to take the loss. It has to reduce its own capital to pay for the loss. And if this is happening too often to a bank, if its customers are defaulting, it might get negative equity, negative capital, and then it's out of business, and then we trigger this event, right? Then we are starting the possible cascading event that we were talking about. Then the DebtRank comes into play. DebtRank is only relevant in this financial network. And then we simulate the thing. We make this model look like the economy of Austria as much as possible. And we also introduce another tax that is discussed among finance ministers, the Tobin tax. This is a tax that is on every transaction, regardless if it's risky or not. It's just a percentage of the transaction volume, so typically 5% of the interest rate or 2 basis points of the transaction volume. And now we compare 3 different schemes. One where we do no systemic risk management, we just regulate the banking system as it is regulated now in the Basel II framework. In one scenario, we implement the systemic risk tax, and in the third one, we look at this Tobin tax. So this is the profile that I've shown you. We gauge the model in a way that we get a systemic risk profile in the model that is more or less the same as this one. If we turn on now the systemic risk tax and run the simulations 10,000 times, or you can also run it 2 times or 1 time, then you get a complete shift reduction of systemic risk. If you turn on the Tobin tax, you get a little bit of reduction. We'll see why. This is the systemic risk of the individual transactions. In the model, we see almost the same cloud. The red cloud, it's covered by the other 2 clouds, but the red cloud is also here, it's around here. If we turn on the systemic risk tax, we are doing what we wanted to do. We are avoiding these risky tax. We're shifting this cloud by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude downward. Okay, and the Tobin tax shifts it a little bit downward. This I have shown you. This is the loss distribution for banks. If we're not doing anything, it's the red curve. We have this fat tail, this power law of losses. And if we're turning on the systemic risk tax, we cut off this tail. Okay? Now we are controlling a complex system by by restructuring the network. That's the idea behind it. The Tobin tax does not do much, and this curve here, the green curve, is what? It's the economic risk. That's the risk that your idea does not fly. It's the risk that the company goes bankrupt. This will happen all the time. Why? Because we are not making perfect companies. Because we're not having always perfect ideas. So this will happen all the time. We cannot get rid of this, but we can get rid of this tail. This tail is just due to the nature of the network that emerges nowadays randomly. There's no one designing that network. But with the tax, we can design it in a way that it becomes effectively a network where the hole does not get bigger. This is the distribution of cascades. If you don't do anything, you have a huge number of big cascades. When one bank defaults, many others will default. This is the cascade size distribution, which is becomes very small if you turn on this tax. And now this is very, very important. This is the total transaction volume in the system. If I reduce the transaction volume, I can always make the system safer. If the transaction volume is 0, there's no risk, no systemic risk, nothing. But we can also not have credit. And we want to have credit. So we must make the system safer by not making it smaller, by not reducing the credit volume. And that's what I'm showing here. The red curve is the distribution of credit volume if you run many, many simulations. It's a Gaussian. If you turn on the systemic risk tax, the transaction volume stays the same. If we use the Tobin tax, what is happening is that credit becomes more expensive. People take less credit, credit volume goes down. Look at the amount. It goes from 55 to 40. It's a huge reduction of credit. This is why people don't want to implement it. So, and why does the green curve not shift to the left? Because we're just rearranging a network. We're not making it sparser. We're not suggesting to make links more expensive or less. If you don't believe agent-based models, which I advise you to do, or be very careful if someone tells you results showing agent-based models, you can also show in a mathematical proof that there exist 2 types of equilibria. one with a systemic risk tax, one without a systemic risk tax. And you can prove that in the systemic risk tax equilibrium, systemic risk is almost, it's much, much, much less. Yeah. This is the theorem that we prove there. Okay, in the sake of time, I think maybe I should come to an end. But what could go wrong is that the credit layer is not the relevant one. That we should have looked at one of the other, now we were just looking at these contributions here. Maybe the other contributions are much more relevant. Let's look at it for Mexico. Here's the profile, and we can decompose it into the different levels, and we see that the credit is the blue one. It's very, very little compared to the red ones, for example. It's the foreign exchange exposures. So you have to look really into where your systemic risk comes from. Another thing, maybe just for the experts of you or economists, we're now transitioning from the Basel II regulation to Basel III regulation. And Basel III regulation promises to take care of systemic risk for the first time. Is it working or not? We can try to answer in the agent-based model again, where we just implement what is done in the Basel III thing. So I don't go into this. This is how the Basel III capital requirements are computed. There's a little bit of details here. Most of it we can implement directly in the agent-based model. And this is what we find. The red curve is the systemic risk profile if you don't do anything. The blue curve is if you implement Basel III. Systemic risk does not change at all. It even gets a little bit bigger. Not much, but a little bit bigger. Just for comparison, if you turn on the systemic risk tax, then it goes down. Why is that? Because Basel III just punishes you. You have to pay. You have to put more capital aside if you are risky, but you are not changing anything in your networks. It's just affecting your capitalization side and not your networks. As soon as you do something with networks, you're really bringing the risk down. Yeah, here's the maybe not. If we are doing a thought experiment, and if we say if we make the capital requirements of the Basel III agreement three times more than it is intended now, 3 times more costly, then it would start working. So the blue one is if you do nothing. If you do nothing, and the yellow one, if you're making it 3 times more expensive, which would change the transaction volume from 45 to 30, which would destroy the economy completely. So no one could ever think of such a crazy Basel III thing. But this is what would be needed to be comparable, or not even yet comparable to the systemic risk tax, which affects the network structure. Okay, I think I'll not talk about this, otherwise we'll all starve. Thank you.
In the beginning, the point that was made was that every individual bank does not know about the systemic risk. But once you give a tax based on systemic risk, now they have this information.
Yes, good.
So would they behave differently, and would that cause problems?
So you're saying that now I could ask you for 1 million rupees, I would get the information about you because of the systemic risk tax, right?
Yeah, because I know this is the tax I'm paying. I know that what is my systemic risk.
Yes.
Then I would behave differently.
So, and then I ask everyone else for the same amount of rupees. And then from this information, can I infer something about the books?
So I know my systemic risk, right? Since I say I
no, you don't know your systemic risk.
But if I'm paying taxes based on my systemic risk, then I know my systemic risk.
No. You're paying systemic risk because I'm paying systemic risk if I borrow from you. And it depends on my position in the network and on your position in the network. So I cannot, I don't know my systemic risk. I could ask the central bank. If they could tell me my debt rank, but I think usually they would not do that.
Public? Isn't the data public?
No. These interbank networks, this is the bank books. This is super proprietary. So all the central bank could do is say, you pay this tax to him, or I pay this tax, not to him, to the government. I pay the tax, this amount. So all I could do is I could ask all of you, record all the taxes, and then try to say something about you. I could try to work out what are your books, and if I know your books, I can arbitrage you. Can I really do it? No. Why? It's the same problem. If I know the first eigenvector, can I infer the matrix? I cannot. It's not a one-to-one problem, it's a many-to-one. So I think for naive arbitrage, there's no way. I think that should answer your question, if you can.